Welcome to the second podcast in CYB101 Media and Communication Texts. This week we're going to be talking about semiotics, and this is the first of two podcasts which introduce you to semiotic theory. So we'll be talking about signs and signification in this podcast, and in our next podcast we'll be looking at the ways in which signs create meaning. And these two podcasts will form the basis of your first assignment in KCB 101, which is a semiotic textual analysis of an advertisement. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about what semiotics actually is. Semiotics simply is the study of signs. So it's understanding and analyzing communication through the use of signs. So semiotics, the study of signs, and analyzing communication through the use of signs. Now, the next question that comes to mind is, what is a sign? This definition from Graham Turner in his book British Cultural Studies, an introduction, which there were a couple of chapters from last week which I set as additional readings. I think this definition from Turner explains very nicely what a sign is. So I'd encourage you to pause me for a moment and read what Turner is saying here. So there are a couple of things which I want you to pay careful attention to in this definition from Graham Turner. So a sign is the smallest unit of communication in a language system. So it's a word, it's a photo, a sound, an image on a screen, a musical note. It has to have a physical form. So the first major characteristic is that a sign must have a physical form. You must be able to hear it, see it, touch it in some instances, but it's physical. A sign is physical. It has to refer to something other than itself. Now, that concept, the idea that a sign refers to something other than itself, is a little bit tricky. And if you're not quite sure what that means, don't worry too much, because hopefully by the end of this podcast, that will become a little clearer for you. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, it will become extremely clear. But a sign always points to something other than itself. So a photo is not, a photo of a person is not that person. It is a photo. That sounds kind of obvious, but that's the kind of distinction that Turner's talking about. So a television program and all the various elements that make up a television program, say for argument's sake, MasterChef, that is not literally MasterChef. So that's not witnessing the event live. That is a recording of what went on in the MasterChef studio. So a sign refers to something other than itself. And the third characteristic of a sign is that it's recognized as a sign by other people. So signs and our understanding of them rely on convention. Now that's another really important characteristic of signs, and we're going to come back to that over the course of the next 2 weeks, because convention and what we agree to call a sign and how we define a sign plays an important role in understanding semiotics. So that issue of social convention plays an important role. So a sign has three characteristics. It has a physical form, it refers to something other than itself, and people, us, refer to, people, i.e. us, acknowledge that a sign is what it is. So there's a level of convention there. Underpinning the idea of semiotic theory are these 4 points. So the first one is that meaning is abundant. Meaning is all around us. The world is made up of signs. So once you become more familiar and more comfortable doing semiotic analysis, you will be able to understand the world as one great, big, enormous text, which can be read. And at that point, you'll really annoy your friends and family, because you'll then walk around deconstructing everything and picking apart the meaning of just about everything that you see, and really, really annoying them, and they'll just tell you to shut up. Again, that's another really good sign, bad pun, sorry about that, another really good indication that you're understanding what it is that we're talking about in KCB 101 when you sort of begin doing spontaneous textual analysis and can't help yourself. So meaning is abundant, and as a result of that, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Meaning doesn't exist in a vacuum. So as Kate Bowles says here in her chapter in the textbook, The Media and Communications in Australia, meaning doesn't sit inside a text like a bone waiting to be dug up by an anthropologist. So we're not talking about, when we do semiotic analysis, we're not really talking about the hidden meaning, although some of the meanings and some of the interpretations that we make do draw on history, draw on, quite broad cultural understandings of the world, but these are meanings that are familiar to most people. So when we do semiotics, we're not doing anything particularly unusual or doing anything different to what we do in our everyday life. We're giving it a new name. We're putting a collection of terms and theories around what it is that we're doing, but we are all natural semioticians. So we all go around interpreting the world. So the world is a rich text. Meaning doesn't exist in a vacuum. We're familiar with many of the meanings which media texts produce. We're just simply, when we do semiotic analysis, we're just simply giving a name and putting some theoretical concepts around those interpretations. But the upshot of all of this is that once you learn to think semiotically and engage in semiotics, the world never looks the same way again. And that's why this is a beautiful unit, a really fun unit, KCB 101, to be studying, because at its core, we're asking you to look at the world in a new way. We're not asking you to look at the world in a way that doesn't make sense. We're asking you or to unpick those kind of hidden obscure meanings, but we are asking you to understand the way the world operates at a textual level. And that's really exciting. Now, underpinning all of this is a concept which, for some of you, I think is going to blow your mind. Hopefully not literally via a mushroom cloud, so we don't want anyone's brain to explode, but this concept inevitably, that I'm about to introduce, inevitably confuses a few people. And that's okay. Again, hang with it, and you will, by the end of this podcast, and certainly the tutorials, that go that correspond to this podcast in week 3, this idea will be more familiar, and hopefully you'll be more comfortable with it. And that idea is that without language, the world is meaningless. So the world as we know it does not exist until we use language to describe it. So unless we can name something, unless we can point to something and name it, then it technically doesn't exist. Yes, I am serious. I'm deadly serious, because that idea that ultimately language is just a set of social conventions that we all agree to is what underpins semiotic theory. So let me say that again. The idea that language is simply just a set of social conventions that we agree to and use in our everyday lives is at the heart of semiotic theory and what underpins semiotics. Let me give you an example. Our names are a perfect example of the conventional nature of language. The idea that the world is meaningless unless we put language to it or give something or someone a name. Let me introduce you to David. So David is he's a hypothetical CYB101 student, but this is David. Now, there is no intrinsic Davidness about David. We have this cliche in everyday conversation where you meet someone for the first time and they introduce themselves to you and you say, "Oh yes, you look like a David," or "You look like a Jane," or "You look like a Jason." That makes no sense. That makes no sense at all, because there is no intrinsic Davidness about David. Now, why is this gentleman called David? Well, his parents, when he was born, decided that that was the name he was going to have. And they decided, his parents decided that simply through a matter of convention, through a decision which may have been arbitrary to a greater or lesser extent, that the world was going to know this guy as David. And we all agree to do that. So we know when David introduces himself as David, we simply agree to call this guy David. Now, let's push this idea of language as simply an arbitrary convention which we just agree to use in a particular way a little further. So, David. Now, let's assume for a moment that our hypothetical CYB101 student, David, is an international student. And like many international students, and if you are an international student, you may fall into this category. You've decided that when you're here in Australia studying that you're going to go by a different name than the one your parents gave you. So something that might be a little more Western sounding, for want of a better phrase. Heaps of international students do that. And you might be one of them. So let's assume for a moment that when he was born, this gentleman's parents decided to name him Ahn. So A-H-N, Ahn. All through his life in his home country, David, this person has been called Ahn. So his friends, his relatives, school teachers, everyone referred to him as Ahn. Now, he comes to Australia for whatever reason, and again, you know, I'm being deliberately vague here when I say for whatever reason, because it's simply an arbitrary decision in many ways, an arbitrary convention that while I'm here in Australia studying at QUT, studying KCB 101, I want to be referred to, I want people to call me David. So when he registers for classes, Arne puts David in his given name category. And we all agree, while he's here in Australia, that we refer to Arne as David. So it's just a matter of convention. It's just simply a matter of convention. What that means is that we can talk about signs on a continuum of arbitrary through to motivated signs. Arbitrary versus motivated signs. So because language is arbitrary and visual signs are very fixed or are more fixed in their meaning, we can think about signs as existing on a continuum. And at one end of that continuum, we have the idea of the arbitrary sign. So language, as we've just explained in the previous two slides, language is simply a matter of convention. So for argument's sake, we have the word Drake. Drake, the word, could refer to a whole range of things. It could refer to a male duck. It could refer to Sir Francis Drake. It may also refer to extremely popular Canadian hip-hop R&B artist Drake. But we don't know. We don't know until that word exists in a particular context. All the way through to a highly motivated visual sign, a photo of Drake. Now, again, there's a matter of kind of cultural knowledge here. So to someone who isn't familiar with Drake, the performer, this photo, they're not going to know it as Drake. They're just going to, you know, identify it as a reasonably handsome man. But with the appropriate knowledge, with the appropriate understanding, with the appropriate set of conventions, we can look at this photo and say, that's Drake, the hip-hop performer. Now, in the middle of those two extremes, so on one hand, the arbitrary sign, language, the word written, Drake, all the way through to a portrait of Drake, we have in the middle something that's a little bit more ambiguous, and this is one of Drake's album covers. Now, it's obviously, because it's a visual sign, more motivated than simply the word Drake. So there's a particular context here. But again, you've got to be familiar with that context for this photo on the Drake album cover to make sense. So you have to know beforehand that this is a Drake album cover. The figure sitting on top of the tower there may or may not be Drake. We don't know. It's too small. But if you've read articles about Drake's albums, you'll know that this is one of them. I think they still exist, CD shops, going to buy CDs, and you see this album, and it is in the Drake section of the CD shop, you know it's Drake. But again, so it's a little bit more motivated, but there's still a lot of convention and cultural knowledge required to understand that photo in the middle is indeed a representation of Canadian hip-hop R&B artist Drake. So signs exist all the way on this, signs exist on this continuum, from arbitrary signs like language all the way through to more motivated, more literal signs, if you like, such as a photo. Now, along that continuum from arbitrary to motivated signs, we can define 3 types of signs within that continuum. So we can talk about icons, an index, or a symbol. Icon, index, and symbol. Now, an icon directly relates to the object to which it refers. So the classic icon, or the classic example of an icon, is a photo of a person. So our Drake photo, it is quite a literal representation of Drake. An index is a sign which points to something other than itself. In this instance, the classic example is smoke is an index of fire. Smoke is an index of fire. So you see smoke, you automatically equate that with fire. So when we see smoke coming from somewhere, we automatically become either curious, scared, go and investigate, because there's a good chance that something may be on fire. So smoke points to the fire, and an index is a sign which points to something other than itself. The third type of sign is a symbol, where meaning is simply a matter of agreement or convention. So our friend from a couple of slides ago, David/Arn, depending on what context you're in, you'll either call him David or Arn, or maybe both. And we'll understand exactly who it is that we're talking about. So we have icons, index or indices is the plural, and symbols. Icon, index, or symbol. This is a pretty easy one. This is an icon. It is a pretty literal, and by pretty literal, I mean very literal, representation of Miley Cyrus. Nothing really ambiguous about that. It's a good, clear photo of Miley Cyrus. We recognize it as Miley Cyrus. Icon, index, or symbol. Now this is a little bit of a tricky one, because there's, even though when we see this sign, we will, and we're driving, we will immediately, or at least we should, come to a stop. The decision to come to a stop is actually a matter of convention. So this stop sign is a symbol. It is a symbol. There is nothing, let's break this sign down into its component parts for a minute. There's nothing intrinsically, there's nothing that says intrinsically stop about a hexagonal shape. Nothing at all. It's simply a matter of convention that the hexagonal sign in Western cultures, and we're going to have a look at some different signs, stop signs in a minute, the hexagonal sign symbolizes stop. Again, and this is a tricky one. This is a tricky one because it's so ingrained in our culture that we take this as common sense. There is actually nothing about the color red that means intrinsically we should stop. Yes, we associate red with stop, danger, all of those sorts of things. But again, that is just a matter of convention. It's a convention that has remained consistent for centuries, but it is convention. And of course, the word stop, made up of the letters S-T-O-P, or 4 funny squiggles, if you don't understand English, again, is a matter of convention. It's simply a matter of convention. So someone who doesn't understand English is going to look at those letters and not really have any idea necessarily what they should do. They might know because the color red is kind of fair to say it's probably universally accepted, or reasonably universally, if I can use an oxymoron, accepted as something that symbolizes stop or danger, so they might understand it, but there's no guarantee. This stop sign is a matter of convention. And we can see the conventional nature of stop signs by looking at some from countries other than Australia. Now, if I was seeing these signs, I'd probably be in a bit of trouble because I have literally forgotten where they come from. Now, I'm pretty sure I tried to pick some obscure ones in there, and I'm pretty sure the hexagonal red one with no writing on it actually comes from Libya. I'm fairly certain it actually comes from Libya. No language, no words written on there. So it's simply relying on our understanding that the hexagonal red sign symbolizes stop. I'm pretty sure the middle one comes from Japan. Although if you know Japanese and know that that's not Japanese writing, feel free to correct me, sorry. But again, to a non-native speaker of that language, those are going to look like strange squiggles. And even more confusing is the fact that, for a Westerner at least, that this is a triangle. This sign is a triangle. It's not a hexagon. So we're looking at it and going, whoa, what does this mean? What does this mean? It's red. That convention holds true. So we might be able to say, okay, this sign's probably saying that we should exercise caution or that there's some element of danger here. But if we're in that culture and don't read the language and aren't familiar with the conventions, we may have a few problems. Now, the final sign is a stop sign from Turkey. And this one, again, it's a circle and a triangle rather than a hexagon. The hand in the middle, we recognize that as symbolizing stop, halt. But again, that's a matter of convention. That is a matter of convention. So we don't necessarily have to automatically understand that hand as symbolizing stop. So the stop sign, hopefully through this quite detailed explanation, the stop sign we now can understand as a symbol. Agreeing to stop when we see that sign is a matter of convention. And by process of elimination, of course, this sign, the classic My Family sticker, which you used to see, you don't see that much anymore, on the backs of cars, is an index. It's an index. Or at least in this instance, it operates as an index because the stickers, the figures that make up this sticker, point to the type of family that is inside the car. So these stickers point to something or someone other than itself. In this case, the family that drives this car or gets around in this car. So the My Family sticker here operates as an index. Now, we're going to be talking about these in more detail in the tutorials. You're going to get to practice identifying icons, indices, and symbols through a couple of online exercises and also in tutorials. So if you're not 100% comfortable with these ideas yet, don't worry, you will be very, very quickly. So we've spoken about the three different types of signs which make up the foundations of semiotic theory, Now, those signs are made up of two components. So any sign is made up of two components, and those components are the signifier and the signified. The signifier and the signified. Now, the signifier is the physical appearance of the sign. So the words on a page, words on a screen, images on a screen, sounds traveling through the air. So the signifier of this podcast are the words on the PowerPoint slides that you're reading, my voice recording, which is traveling through the air either via your computer or phone speakers or via your headphones. So the signifier is the physical appearance of the sign. And don't get hung up too much on that. Don't overthink that. The signifier is literally the physical appearance of the sign. That's all it is. The second component of the sign, which we want to think about, is the signified. The signified. Now, the signified is the mental concept which we attach to the signifier. The mental concept which we attach to the signifier. The signified is a little more complex. It's a little more complex, and it's a little more arbitrary and depending upon convention than the signifier. Let's explain. Let's explain the difference, or let's explain how the signifier and the signified work. The classic example is cats and dogs. So the two most common family pets, and these are my pets, or rather the cat is my pet, that is Professor Binks, my cat who lives with me, and the three dogs, I forgot our most recent addition. The three dogs belong to my partner Liz, and they live with her, but I'm their adopted dad. So we've got the black dog, the two Italian greyhounds. The black one is Starla, the fawn is Tippy, and our newest addition, the little Chihuahua Queenie. So they're our pets, and they're pretty standard cats and dogs. Now, let's understand the difference here. Let's use these to understand the difference between the signifier and the signified. Now, these are all pretty good, pretty clear, reasonably cute photos of cats and dogs. You know, so what you're seeing here are four signifiers. For representations, for physical images of cats and dogs. Nothing more than that. That's the signifier. Now, I gave away in what I was saying in my description of those photos an element of the signified and how ingrained it is in our culture, because I referred to these photos as cute. Now, there's nothing intrinsically cute about those photos. They are simply computer generated images of those cats and dogs. But, you know, I live with these, I live with the cat. I spend a lot of time living with and hanging out with the dogs. I've got a relationship to them. I have a mental image. I have a set of emotions, if you like, which I attach to these animals. And they're very positive. Apart from when he's not waking me up at 4 o'clock in the morning asking for food, you know, Binks is pretty cool. He's kind of awesome. I love him. He's a great companion. And again, when Queenie is not trying to climb all over me, usually to get food as well, I have very fond feelings towards all of my partner's dogs. So they are the signifieds. I would think of them as cute, adorable, very playful, affectionate, feisty, all of those things. Now, you don't know these animals, but you can look at these photos and develop some reasonably quick mental images, some reasonably quick signifieds, which you could attach to these photos. So you might think of them as cute also. I've deliberately picked the cutest photos possible. You might think of them as playful. You know, Queenie's outstretched paws there. Bink's in his little tunnel looking like he's ready to pounce. You might think of them as playful or not. You might hate dogs. So you might think of dogs as smelly, as annoying. You know, if you've been bitten by a dog, so a previous experience by a dog might lead you to think of dogs as aggressive. Similarly, if you're not a cat person, you might think of cats as aloof. You might also think of them as smelly. You might think of them as kind of unfriendly, cold, unfeeling, those types of things. So the mental image that we attach to a sign, the signified which we attach to any signifier, depends upon our previous experience with similar types of signs. So based on whether we're a dog person or a cat person or both or neither, our mental images which we attach to these photos will differ. Now the signified is a little bit tricky because we rarely stop to think about the mental concepts we attach to signs. They just are, or at least we think of it as just being so. So we look at those photos and depending upon our previous experience, our cultural backgrounds, we will look at a photo of a dog and go, oh, that's cute, or oh my God, I hate dogs. Similarly, we'll do the same for cats. So we kind of think about the signified as representing common sense, but they're not natural. The signifieds are not natural. Rather, the mental concepts that we attach to any sign is established through code, which are an informal set of cultural agreements. So you might look at a dog and go, oh, I hate dogs. And your friend might go, really? Why? I love dogs. So how we relate to any particular sign or the mental concept or the signified that we attach to any signifier is a matter of agreement. And in semiotic theory, we refer to these informal cultural agreements as conventions. And conventions are all around us. We think of them as common sense, but they're all around us. This one's going to form the basis of our first online activity, and where I'm going to get you to give some responses to this question. Do we look at this photo of this person and think of him as a good guy or a bad guy, and why? So is this a good guy or a bad guy, and how do we know that? Similarly, why do we consider this person attractive? Now, there is the statement that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but Whether you're male, whether you're female, whether you're gay, whether you're straight, whether you're somewhere in between, we as a culture look at this guy and go, yeah, he's attractive. Whether or not you'd want to date him, marry him, have sex with him is beside the point. We look at him and go, yeah, he's attractive. Why? What is it about this photo, this signifier, that leads to those signifieds, leads to those mental concepts? Now, again, you're going to have a look at a photo, this photo or a similar photo, and try and explain why. Try and explain what those codes and conventions are that lead us to look at this photo and go, yes, hot, attractive. Now, to wrap up, we have been across 5 areas today. We've defined semiotics. We've had a look at what we mean by the term semiotics. We've defined the sign. We've looked at what a sign is and the main elements of a sign. We've looked at the difference between arbitrary and motivated signs. We've looked at the difference between the icon, index, and symbol as the 3 foundational signs. And we've also looked at the signifier and the signified and the difference between those. And that difference between the physical representation of the sign and the mental image that we associate with that physical representation is something that we're going to explore in tutorials and is going to form the basis of our next podcast, which looks in more detail at how signs create meaning. So thank you very much, folks, and we look forward to seeing you in tutorials. Thanks.